Hello class! This week we are going over chapter 7 of the textbook and we're going to be talking about deviance, crime, and social control. On this first slide we have an introductory video on deviance. You only need to watch the first 13 minutes for the purposes of just introducing y'all to what deviance is, different perspectives about deviance, and some examples to kind of illustrate kind of the wide-ranging definition that deviance can take on. So just watch the first 13 minutes of this introductory video. It will cover deviance, which basically means defiance of norms, and it points out that deviance is what the group defines deviance as. So as we'll see in the slides to come, deviance and what it means, it changes depending on what society you are looking at. So deviance can bring about social change, but it can also bring about social problems. And we'll talk about different ways that it can bring about social change and cause social problems during this lecture. The video will also give you a few examples of deviance and how it can alter depending on what society you're looking at. For instance, the different drinking ages in different countries. So if you're drinking under the age of 21 in the US, that's a deviant act, because it's against the norms of the laws of our country. But if you are 16 in France, you are allowed to drink. If you're 18 in Brazil, you're allowed to drink. In Jamaica, there is no minimum drinking age, so there's no point at which drinking is deviant. And then we can also look at a lot of Muslim societies don't permit drinking ever at any age. So that's just one illustration of how you have to take into account the society that you're looking at when considering what is deviant. And another example that the video covers is changes in the acceptability of women's swimwear in the US since the 1950s. So if you think back to 1950s bathing suits, there's a lot of coverage happening, didn't want to be exposed above the knee. Bathing suits had little half sleeves on them. And then, of course, you all live in modern society. Women and men can go to the beach wearing a thong. So there's been a lot of changes in modesty, especially for women in U.S. society since the 1950s. And so there have been different standards of what a deviant bathing suit looks like since the 1950s compared to today. This video also, toward the end of those 13 minutes, will introduce concepts which we'll return to later in this lecture, such as formal and informal sanctions, the degradation ceremony, and it will give you a little overview of the different sociological perspectives on deviance from the perspectives of functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. So as usual, we will start with a definition to get us started on this lecture. So what is deviance? We can define it sociologically as a violation of established contextual, cultural, or social norms, whether folkways, mores, or codified law. So remember, folkways, they are norms that are more informal. So like there's kind of an informal law or rule in society to not skip in front of somebody in line at a supermarket. It might not be a codified law, but it's something that as society we generally agree to, and we kind of scorn others if they transgress those folkways. or picking your nose in public would be more of a folk way. There's no codified law that a police officer is going to arrest you for picking your nose in public. It's a folk way. It's more of a common social agreement that you don't pick your nose in public. So that's a folk way. And then mores are social rules that are undergirded with some sense of moral obligation. Usually mores are also they turn into codified law because the society agrees on them usually, and usually it also has a bit of a moral underpinning. So mores usually turn into codified law. So deviance is a violation of any of these, folkways, mores, or codified law, and for that reason, deviance can be as minor as picking your nose in public or as major as committing a murder. So deviance does not always result in punishment. What people agree is deviance. It varies over time, like we were talking about on the last slide with women's bathing suits since the 1950s. So deviance varies over time and across different societies and subcultures. So again, different societies, like on the last slide, and the video talks about the different drinking ages in different societies. So if you're drinking at age 16, that would be deviant in the United States, but it would not be deviant in France, for instance. And then whether an act is defined as deviant depends on a society's response to the act. So again, it's society that is defining what deviance is or is not. We have to look at each particular society to determine what deviance means to that group of people. Now, when we're thinking about deviance, again, it's about what society defines as deviance. So society has to control kind of this regulation and enforcement of these social norms in order to also enforce what is deviant in society. So what is social control? Again, that's the regulation and enforcement of norms. But social control requires social order. So social order is the arrangement of practices and behaviors on which society's members base their daily lives. So the goal is to maintain social order, and social control is kind of the enforcement of norms so that social order continues. So we can think of social order as the employee handbook, kind of lays out what's right and wrong according to the society, and then social control is the manager that makes sure that the guidelines set forth in that employee handbook are followed through on. Now, social control can be maintained by means of positive sanctions and negative sanctions. So sanctions are the means of enforcing society's rules and norms. So positive sanctions are rewards for conforming to norms. So we maintain social control by kind of rewarding good behavior. And if the rest of society sees good behavior as being rewarded, then that will give them an incentive to also kind of fall in line with society's rules and norms. So positive sanctions, an example would be you work really hard at your job, you meet all your deadlines, maybe you finished a really successful project in the last quarter, and then you're given a promotion. So that would be a positive sanction. You're conforming to the norms of your company, even maybe excelling, going beyond what is asked, and so you're rewarded. On the other hand, negative sanctions are punishments for violating norms. So negative sanctions, obviously, if other people in the society see that people are being punished for violating norms, it will keep more people in check in terms of kind of following society's guidelines for the social order. So a negative sanction would be you go to the mall, you shoplift a couple items from the department store, and they catch you on the cameras and you're arrested. So that's a negative sanction. As a society, we agree that private property is a very important aspect of our society and laws. And so stealing or shoplifting needs to be met with a certain punishment that signals to other shoppers and other members of the society that yes, you will be negatively affected. You will be punished if you violate this social norm of respecting property and not stealing others' property. Now that we have a little bit of a general idea of what deviance is and social control and social order and positive and negative sanctions, we're going to delve into kind of the theoretical perspectives on deviance. And remember those big three theories of functionalism, structural functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. Now, when we're talking about deviance, structural functionalism, in this lecture we're going to talk about kind of three sub-theories within structural functionalism on the next few slides. Then we will look at conflict theory's perspective on deviance, and then there are three sub-theories under symbolic interactionism. So this theory is a little bit this lecture is a little bit more dense than previous lectures, but we'll just go over each kind of sub-theory and theoretical perspective and go over the broad outline of each one and the different value that it brings to the debate when we are looking at issues of deviance in society. And I also just want to note, when we're talking about all of these big theoretical perspectives and ideas from functionalism and conflict theory and symbolic interactionism, and you'll see very soon all these kind of sub-theories that come out of these bigger theoretical perspectives. It's important to note that it's not about any one of these theories being 100% right, making all of the other ones wrong. It's just a different kind of lens to look at each issue with, and really combining all of the theories will give us the most fruitful kind of holistic understanding of deviance and other social issues. So it's not about any one of them being right and all of the others being wrong. They all together, when looked at, when you look at each perspective and kind of understand each perspective and then put it all together, it will give us a fuller idea of what we're dealing with. So for the next few slides, we're going to start with functionalism. And there are three sub-theories, again, within structural functionalism. So we're going to start with the first one, that's Robert Merton's strain theory. So Robert Merton came up with strain theory, and he's a functionalist. So he says that deviance is inherent, it's going to happen in every society. But he said access to acceptable societal goals plays a large part in determining whether a person conforms or deviates to society's norms. So not everyone in our society stands on equal ground in terms of being able to conform to society's ideals. So for instance, American society is structured to ensure that the vast majority of people can never realistically attain these kind of social ends of health, wealth, personal happiness through the means of hard work that most Americans are socialized to believe will help them achieve the American dream. For example, if someone has the goal of the American dream of achieving individual financial success, but doesn't have the access to a stellar education or social networks that can connect them with the right people, that individual may turn to less socially acceptable routes in order to achieve their goal of being independently successful and making money. So if someone has that goal, they want to kind of achieve that American dream, but they don't have access to the means, like the socially approved means in order to get there, they might turn to more criminal or less socially acceptable means to make that money and be financially independent. For instance, they might start embezzling money or commit a burglary. So we'll go a little bit more into Robert Merton's strain theory in the next 2 slides. So Merton is basically saying that society kind of puts up these social norms for us to aspire to, but a lot of societies don't function well enough. Again, he's a structural functionalist, and they don't function in order to give all members of the society kind of those means to achieve those social goals and norms. So Merton says we're putting kind of this strain on a lot of people in society that they still might want to achieve these social goals or norms, like for instance the American dream, but they don't have the right tools, in other words, to get there. So Merton said that there's 5 different ways that people respond to this gap between having a socially acceptable goal and having no socially acceptable way to pursue that goal. So there's 5 different kind of categories he introduces here. Number 1 is the conformity category, and these are the people who choose to conform. They choose not to deviate. Then we have the innovators, number 2. Innovation, those who pursue goals they cannot achieve through legitimate means by instead using criminal or deviant means. Then we have the ritualists, number 3. And these are the people who lower their goals until they can reach them through socially acceptable ways. So maybe they started out with a goal of being a millionaire entrepreneur, but they've realized over time maybe that's not going to happen for them, and they lower their goals, maybe make a new goal of just owning a home and making $40,000 a year consistently, and so they change their goals and then go about reaching those goals in socially acceptable ways. So going and getting a job that will get them $40,000 a year. So the ritualists, they're focused on conformity rather than trying to achieve lofty dreams or goals. Then the 4th category are the retreatists. And retreatism represents those who reject society's goals and means or have withdrawn from society's goals of financial success. And then there's the rebels, number 5. And these are the people who rebel and try to replace the society's goals and means with their own and aim to completely overthrow society's goals through socially unacceptable means. So we'll go over some examples and kind of parse out the differences between these 5 categories of people according to Robert Merton's strain theory on the next slide. So on this slide is a bit of a visual representation of Robert Merton's typology of individual responses to social norms and social control. Again, this is a continuation of the explanation of strain theory, which is a functionalist kind of sub-theory. So we're going to go through these 5 categories and just break it down a little bit more here. So we'll start with conformity. So the goal of success, the conformists accept the goal of success in society, wanting to be financially independent, achieve that American dream. The conformists accept the means as legitimate. So you're not going to, the conformists are not going to involve themselves in any criminal activity to get their financial success. And type, most people fit into this category in society. Most people go to work and earn the money that they can, go to college, and get a degree to pursue a career in order to be kind of financially independent and bring in a stable income and try to kind of achieve the American standard of living. So then we have our second category, the innovators, and these are the people that we most of the time consider criminal in society. So criminals, they actually agree with society's goal of success. They do want to be rich. They do want to make money, and they do want to be financially secure and independent and kind of achieve that American dream, but the means that they go about achieving that goal are illegitimate or deviant. So examples of the innovators would be kind of, your mafia, your gangsters like Tony Montana. And then number 3, we have the ritualists. So these are also deviant. They, though, reject the goal of success set forth by society. So they're not trying to make the most money that they possibly can. They kind of change their expectations, maybe, and they kind of lessen them. Again, like I said on the last slide, somebody who, when they were a teenager, imagined themselves making millions of dollars, might at a certain point realize that they don't have the connections or education to get to that goal, and so they kind of lessen their social expectation. They lessen their goal and no longer expect to make millions of dollars, are just happy to make $40,000, $35,000 a year. But they go about this legitimately, so they're still working in a job, a secure job possibly, but for pretty low pay. So the ritualists are people who work in kind of dead-end jobs, somebody who maybe works in retail their entire life. They're making money, they're providing for themselves, but they're not, as Merton would see it, going far enough to kind of reach that American or Western dream of being an independent millionaire entrepreneur, for instance. And then we have the 4th category, retreatism, also an example of deviance. The retreatists reject the goal of financial independent success. They also reject the means of achieving that success. So getting a job and honest work throughout your life, hard, honest work. So they reject that as well as illegitimate. And the example of the retreatists, again, it's in the name, they kind of retreat from life and society's goals. And so examples would be kind of your voluntary homeless. Of course, not everyone is voluntarily homeless, but there are some. Or your habitual drug users, or people who just drink all day and don't work. So those are your retreatists. And then number 5 are your rebels. Again, another form of deviance. They, again, reject society's goal of success, but the difference between the rebels and the ritualists and the retreatists is that the rebels actually propose an alternative vision of success, an alternative goal for society to pursue, rather than the one that is set forth. So they propose an alternative, and again, if they're rejecting society's goal of success, they're also kind of rejecting the means to achieving that success, going to work 40 hours a week, making your money, bringing home your paycheck, paying your bills, doing it again. So rebels kind of, again, reject both of these. And an example of your rebels would be Karl Marx. Again, we'll get to conflict theory, and you'll see a bit more of what that means, and Martin Luther King. So people who actually, they reject society's norms and goals, but they propose an alternative. So they see a vision for something beyond or different from what we're doing currently. So that is one of the functionalist sub-theories. That's Robert Merton's strain theory. Okay, so the second sub-theory under functionalism is social disorganization theory. So this theory states that crime is more likely to occur in communities with weak social ties and the absence of social control. And a theorist under social disorganization theory would point to broad social factors like a culture of poverty as the cause of deviance. So functionalists, or within the social disorganization theory, believe that people aren't born deviant, but they just become so over time due to factors in their social environment. So social disorganization theory, there's another name for it, which is broken windows theory, which kind of, it's all in the name. So if you live in a neighborhood or a community that kind of looks like the picture on this slide, like buildings haven't really been kept up, with maybe they're not safe to live in. There's literally broken windows that aren't being repaired. When people don't care about the neighborhood, that don't maybe that they don't care, but they don't have money. Again, that culture of poverty in a certain community, which results in kind of dilapidated buildings or infrastructure not being attended to, large potholes in the road that stay there for 10 years and are not filled in because there's no funds or community organization to kind of fix these things in the social environment. So social disorganization theory says that we kind of internalize the environment that we live in. If we live in an environment that's not cared for, that nobody seems to want to fix or improve, then social disorganization theorists would say people start to kind of internalize the care for their surroundings and kind of fall in line with what they see and what they live in. So for example, a child born into a city where police presence is lacking, where street crime is rampant, where the local schools are inadequate, or where good jobs are hard to find, can be driven to a life of deviance. because of that social environment that they have grown up in. So on this slide, there's a little bit of an illustration, a video here of social disorganization theory and the community activists that are being interviewed in this little PBS special are very much social disorganization theorists. So the little video is called Atlanta's Pockets of Blight, and this video focuses on a neighborhood in Atlanta called Lakewood Heights. It was formerly a white neighborhood wherein most of the white residents worked at the General Motors plant that was close by. And the video talks about during the 60s, a lot of African Americans started to move into the neighborhood. And so that kind of caused what we call white flight, which is when white people kind of leave or move out of a neighborhood if they see too many different people moving in there. And then in the 80s, the General Motors plant closed. So that kind of, the entire composition of the neighborhood completely transformed within about 20 years. And this left the neighborhood with very few kind of services, not a lot of doctor's offices, no grocery stores close by. And one of the quotes from the activists is that because of kind of the dilapidated conditions of this neighborhood of Lakewood Heights, which actually has a very rich history in Atlanta, but she said the actual social environment of the neighborhood, it causes people to feel, quote, powerless. And the activists in this video talk about kind of beautifying the neighborhood and fixing up buildings and roads, taking care of the neighborhood so that they can improve the situation of the people living there. So the activists talk about, quote, turning the neighborhood around. So this is a very social disorganization theory viewpoint on how to combat deviance in society. So people within this viewpoint would say, if people are leading deviant lives, conducting criminal behavior and taking part in it, it's because of their social environment. And so the kind of the fix, the way to improve their situation, you first have to address kind of that physical social environment. So I hope y'all watch this video. It's only 3 minutes long on Atlanta's Lakewood Heights neighborhood. Now the third kind of sub-theory under structural functionalism that we're going to look at is cultural deviance theory, which essentially says that conformity to the prevailing cultural norms of lower class society causes crime. And cultural deviance theory, it's derived from some studies of crime patterns in Chicago in the 1920s and 30s by sociologists Clifford Shaw and Henry McKay. Again, it was developed in the 20s and 30s, so this theory has kind of been challenged over the years. A couple of those other functionalist theories, the string theory and the broken windows or social disorganization theory, have kind of taken more prominence within structural functionalism, but it's still important to cover what Shaw and McKay theorized back in the 20s and 30s when they came up with cultural deviance theory. So when looking at crime patterns in Chicago in the 20s and 30s, what Shaw and McKay found was that most of the crime and violence that occurred in and around Chicago at the time, it was happening in the inner city, kind of that the most central core communities of the city, the people right within the center. So what they came up with was kind of this concentric spatial division of cities in general in order to determine where the highest crime would occur. So it's very much kind of like just looking at a map and saying, all right, right here, right in the center of New York or Miami or Chicago or LA or Seattle, that's where you're going to have the most crime and deviance happening. And as you move outward in kind of this spatial map of concentric circles, you'll find less and less crime. So they found that violence and crime were at their worst toward the middle of the city, and deviance kind of decreased as you moved out from the inner city toward the suburbs, where your wealthier citizens would move, leaving behind the less privileged people in the center of the city. And again, why would they be less privileged? Usually when immigrant groups move to the U.S. or a big city in the U.S., they usually try to locate themselves as close as possible to the job opportunities that are open to them. And another aspect is public transportation. A lot of poor people don't have a personal vehicle to drive 30 minutes into the city to work every day. So a lot of poor people have to live maybe a mile, 3 miles within the area where they can make money and get a job. So poverty, ethnic diversity, and family disruption leads to social disorganization, crime, and delinquency. So if you look at that bottom little graph, depicts kind of this mapping of deviance that Shaw and McKay came up with back in the 20s and 30s. So you've got right in the center of the city is the central business district. That's where most of your restaurants and offices and jobs will be located at. And then kind of that little outside circle right outside of that is the transitional zone, which this graph notes has a lot of recent immigrant groups living there. And some of the factors that come about in the transitional zone are deteriorated housing, factories, and abandoned buildings. Then right outside of that is the working class zone. So things are a little bit improved there. Crime maybe lessens a little bit. You have a lot of single family tenements here. And then outside of that, you have the residential zone. So your single family homes, start to see bigger homes, more privacy, more land for the homeowner, private yards and garages, and less crime, less deviance. And then in the furthest kind of sector, number 5, the commuter zone, that's where you have your suburban neighborhoods, gated communities, a lot more privacy, security, and a lot less deviance. So for Shaw and McKay, it was kind of a spatial awareness of the city, and they concluded that crime, deviance, would always be at its worst at the middle of the city and would decrease as you kind of moved outward. So those are the 3 structural functionalist theories on deviance. So you have strain theory from Robert Merton, saying the reason that people turn toward deviant lifestyles or choices is because they don't have the socially acceptable means to achieving the social goals that are set forth for them. Then you have the social disorganization theory or broken windows theory, which says that basically the social environment, the way that the buildings look, the way that the roads are paved, if there's cracks in the sidewalk, kind of that social environment leads people to lead deviant lifestyles. And then we have cultural deviance theory from Shaw and McKay, which takes kind of this spatial organization of the city and claims that crime and deviance will be the worst kind of in the inner city, and it will decrease as you move outwards toward kind of the wealthy white suburbs. So that is structural functionalism, and we will move on to conflict theory perspective on deviance now. So conflict theory, again, interprets all society, all social change coming about because of conflict between two groups of people. Usually they would convey it as an oppressed group and the oppressor group. Conflict theory kind of traditionally, again, starting with Marx, views this as kind of conflict between the two different economic classes of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. But as time has gone on, since the 1840s, 50s, 60s, when Marx was writing, conflict theory has kind of incorporated more forms of conflict beyond just the economic. There's obviously racial conflict, and also a lot of people who hold positions of power aren't always necessarily rich, or they're not billionaires at least. So people in the military and politicians and celebrities also can come into play when we're talking about conflict theory, which we will see in the next few pages here. So again, conflict theory interprets crime and deviance as evidence of inequality in the system. So we're going to look at an excerpt here from C. Wright Mills' book, The Power Elite. And if you remember, C. Wright Mills was the one that wrote The Sociological Imagination that we read during the first week of this class. So same guy here. So we are going to look at his Power Elite rating here, where he basically says that a small group of wealthy and influential people at the top of society, not only the rich business executives, but also military leaders, politicians, and celebrities, hold the power and resources to make the rules that govern society. So basically he's saying there's a small group of people at the very top of society. They make the laws, and so all of the laws serve their interests, whether that be economic or military or cultural or political. And so he says deviance is defined by these kind of very powerful or wealthy people. And so conflict theory comes into play because if only a small group of people at the very top echelon of society are making laws that kind of work for them, that kind of sets up a system of conflict when they are criminalizing the behavior of the majority of society. So these people, the power elite, they are deciding what's criminal and what's not criminal, what's deviant, what's not. And again, the effects are often felt by those who have the least wealth and power in society. So on this page, there's a link to chapter 1 from his book, The Power Elite, and then there's a link to this as well on Blackboard. I've chosen a few excerpts from chapter 1, which I will read over in the next few slides just to give you a better understanding of what Mills is arguing here in The Power Elite. Alright, so the next 6 slides, I have a few excerpts from C. Wright Mill's book here. So first, he starts with this following statement. So the powers of ordinary men are circumscribed by the everyday worlds in which they live. Yet even in these rounds of job, family, and neighborhood, they often seem driven by forces they can neither understand nor govern. Great changes are beyond their control, but affect their conduct and outlook nonetheless. The very framework of modern society confines them to projects not their own. But from every side, such changes now press upon the men and women of the mass society, who accordingly feel that they are without purpose in an epoch in which they are without power. Not all men are in this sense ordinary. As the means of information and of power are centralized, some men come to occupy positions in American society from which they can look down upon, so to speak, and by their decisions mightily affect the everyday worlds of ordinary men and women. They are not made by their jobs. They set up and break down jobs for thousands of others. They are not confined by simple family responsibilities. They can escape. They may live in many hotels and houses, but they are bound by no one community. They need not merely, quote, meet the demands of the day and hour, unquote, in some part. They create these demands and cause others to meet them. Whether or not they profess their power, their technical and political experience of it far transcends that of the underlying population. What Jacob Burckhardt said of great men, most Americans might well say of their elite. They are all that we are not. The power elite is composed of men whose positions enable them to transcend the ordinary environments of ordinary men and women. They are in positions to make decisions having major consequences. Whether they do or do not make such decisions is less important than the fact that they do occupy such pivotal positions. Their failure to act, their failure to make decisions, is itself an act that is often of greater consequence than the decisions they do make. For they are in command of the major hierarchies and organizations of modern society. They rule the big corporations. They run the machinery of the state and claim its prerogatives. They direct the military establishment. They occupy strategic command posts of the social structure, in which are now centered the effective means of the power and the wealth and the celebrity which they enjoy. The power elite are not solitary rulers. Advisors and consultants, spokesmen and opinion makers are often the captains of their higher thought and decision. Immediately below the elite are the professional politicians of the middle levels of power in the Congress and in the pressure groups, as well as among the new and old upper classes of town and city and region. Mingling with them, in curious ways which we shall explore, are those professional celebrities who live by being continually displayed but are never, so long as they remain celebrities, displayed enough. If such celebrities are not at the head of any dominating hierarchy, they do often have the power to distract the attention of the public or afford sensations to the masses, or more directly, to gain the ear of those who do occupy positions of direct power. More or less unattached, as critics of morality and technicians of power, as spokesmen of God and creators of mass sensibility, such celebrities and consultants are part of the immediate scene in which the drama of the elite is enacted. But that drama itself is centered in the command posts of the major institutional hierarchies. The way to understand the power of the American elite lies neither solely in recognizing the historic scale of events, nor in accepting the personal awareness reported by men of apparent decision. Behind such men and behind the events of history, linking the two, are the major institutions of modern society. These hierarchies of state and corporation and army constitute the means of power. As such, they are now of a consequence not before equaled in human history. And at their summits, there are now those command posts of modern society which offer us the sociological key to an understanding of the role of the higher circles in America. Within American society, major national power now resides in the economic, the political, and the military domains. Other institutions seem to the side of modern history, and on occasion, duly subordinated to these. No family is as directly powerful in national affairs as any major corporation. No church is as directly powerful in the external biographies of young men in America today as the military establishment. No college is as powerful in the shaping of momentous events as the National Security Council. Religious, educational, and family institutions are not autonomous centers of national power. On the contrary, these decentralized areas are increasingly shaped by the Big Three, in which developments of decisive and immediate consequence now occur. So he's saying there are three big institutions in American society, and that's where kind of conflict theory needs to focus on: the economic, the political, and the military. And these are kind of these interlocking institutions at the head of American society, and the particular people who find themselves in power within those three institutions. So very powerful politicians are military leaders, and very wealthy and successful economic leaders. That these people kind of run American society to their own interests. And he's saying that other institutions like celebrities or churches or schools, that these other institutions are important, but they're kind of reflecting the interests of those big three institutions. So remember back to chapter 4, where we talked about Marx and the base and the superstructure, and how the base was the economy, and all that superstructure, the media and our education and our religion and everything else in social life kind of came out from that economic base and served economic interests in some way. C. Wright Mills here is kind of expanding that idea of the base and the superstructure, but going a little bit beyond Marx, beyond just strictly economic. So C. Wright Mills is saying the base is kind of the economic, but also the political and the military, and that everything else is kind of superstructural. So our religion and education and family institutions are superstructural elements that arise out of kind of economic, political, and military interests. So continue reading these excerpts here. As each of these domains becomes enlarged and centralized, the consequences of its activities becomes greater, and its traffic with others increases, the other institutions. So the decisions of a handful of corporations bear upon military and political, as well as economic developments around the world. The decisions of the military establishment rest upon and grievously affect political life, as well as the very level of economic activity. The decisions made within the political domain determine economic activities and military programs. There is no longer on the one hand an economy, and on the other hand a political order containing a military establishment unimportant to politics and to money-making. There is a political economy linked in 1,000 ways with military institutions and decisions. On each side of the world split running through Central Europe and around the Asiatic rimlands, there is an ever-increasing interlocking of economic, military, and political structures. If there is government intervention in the corporate economy, so is there corporate intervention in the governmental process. In the structural sense, this triangle of power between politics, economics, and military, this triangle of power is the source of the interlocking directorate that is most important for the historical structure of the present. And he's writing this, I believe it was 1951 that he wrote The Power Elite. By the powerful we mean, of course, those who are able to realize their will, even if others resist it. No one, accordingly, can be truly powerful unless he has access to the command of major institutions, for it is over these institutional means of power that the truly powerful are, in the first instance, powerful. Higher politicians and key officials of government command such institutional power. So do admirals and generals, and so do the major owners and executives of the larger corporations. Not all power, it is true, is anchored in and exercised by means of such institutions, but only within and through them can power be more or less continuous and important. The people of the higher circles may also be conceived as members of a top social stratum, as a set of groups whose members know one another, see one another socially and at business, and so in making decisions take one another into account. The elite, according to this conception, feel themselves to be, and are felt by others to be, the inner circle of the upper social classes. They form a more or less compact and psychological entity. They have become self-conscious members of a social class. People are either accepted into this class or they are not, and there is a qualitative split, rather than merely a numerical scale separating them from those who are not elite. They are more or less aware of themselves as a social class, and they behave toward one another differently from the way they do toward members of other classes. They accept one another, understand one another, marry one another, tend to work and to think, if not together, at least alike. So the excerpt from C. Wright Mills' Power Elite kind of illustrates the conflict theory perspective on deviance. He's saying there's this kind of upper echelon of people in the highest positions of economic, political, and military institutions, and that these people in these upper positions, these higher positions, kind of form their own upper social class. And that these people, because of their positions, have the most power in society. They also have the power to define what is deviant and what is not in society. So conflict theory is basically saying that there's a certain upper social class in society. They make the rules, they make the laws, and those laws about what is deviant and what is not deviant reflect their personal interests. But as a result, that puts a lot of other people in society under laws concerning or norms concerning deviance that may not actually reflect their own interests or be to their benefit. So to kind of illustrate conflict theory, an example of a perspective that they would have, I'm going to talk about the 1980s crack epidemic in the United States. So I'm sure most of you are old enough to remember kind of all the anti-marijuana ads that went on during the 1990s, and the DARE program in your elementary school and middle school years, and the commercials on TV of, the egg frying, and this is your brain on eggs. So in the 1980s, there was a very similar campaign against crack in particular. And a lot of commercials and monetary resources put into programs to combat the crack epidemic. So if you've ever watched The Wolf of Wall Street or any movie from the 80s, or you were alive during the 80s, you know that crack and cocaine were both kind of very popular during the 1980s in the United States. But while cocaine was associated more with your Wolf of Wall Street types, your wealthy white people, crack cocaine was associated with poor urban communities, with minority people in particular. So very similar drug, different forms of the drug were more popular with different races. So cocaine was more popular with wealthier white people, and crack cocaine was more associated with poor urban communities, poor white people, and people of color. So to kind of point out what conflict theory's perspective on deviance means, we'll look at the different punishments for these drugs in the 80s. So in 1986, the punishment for 50 grams of crack, that's the one associated with the poor people, was 10-year prison sentence. In 1986, the same punishment, a 10-year prison sentence, was applied for the possession of 5,000 grams of cocaine. So even though it's the same substance, a different form for intake, the prison sentence for 50 grams of crack was 10 years, and for 5,000 grams of cocaine would get you 10 years. So there's kind of a discrepancy here in terms of the punishment for the crime, and the fact that crack was associated with poorer urban minority communities and cocaine was associated with wealthier white communities, for a conflict theorist, kind of points out the kind of the inequality rooted in the system here. So the inequality in the severity of punishment for crack versus cocaine parallels the unequal social class of the respective users. So here I have a couple links to some videos. They are both for links to videos with interviews with Dr. Carl Hart, who's a professor of neuroscience and psychology at Columbia University. Hart is known for his research in drug abuse and drug addiction, and in particular he has studied kind of the effects on the human brain of crack versus cocaine, and the different forms of crack and crack cocaine, and he has concluded over his years of research that it is the same drug with identical results, and thus, if this is what his research concludes, then the only explanation for the differing prison sentences would be a social one. In other words, there's people in the upper echelons of society making laws which discriminate in some sense against kind of the lower class people's primary form of drug versus the wealthier white people's favored form of drug. So there's two videos here. The first one up top is the shorter one. I think it's about 6 minutes long. So I definitely like y'all to watch that one if the topic is interesting to you. And Carl Hart is a very interesting, very well-knowledged expert in his field. So if you're interested in this, you can watch a longer interview that's linked to on the bottom there. And that is the conflict theory perspective on deviance. In short, both Carl Hart and C. Wright Mills are making kind of a conflict theory argument and saying that there are laws in society concerning deviance, and those laws kind of reflect the interests of an upper class of some sort, whether it be economic, political, or military, or a combination of all three. All right, so now we're going to move into the symbolic interactionist viewpoint on deviance. And like with the functionalism, under symbolic interactionism, we have three kind of sub-theories that draw from symbolic interactionism as a whole. So remember, this kind of viewpoint of symbolic interactionism, it's not focused with big institutions or like the social conscious that Durkheim and the functionalists are interested in. Symbolic interactionists are interested on one-on-one, intimate relationships and how those affect us throughout our lives. So let's look at the first sub-theory here, which is labeling theory. Basically, in short, labeling theory says that other people label us as deviant and we internalize that label over time and end up defining ourselves and seeing ourselves as deviant as a result. So labeling theory, it's the ascribing of a deviant behavior to another person by members of society. What's considered deviant, again, is not determined by the behaviors themselves or the people who commit them, but by the reactions of others to these behaviors. What's deviant changes over time and between societies, again, because it's about the societal kind of judgment of a certain behavior that defines deviance. So there's two forms of deviance here under labeling theory. Primary deviance is a violation of norms that does not lead to long-term effects on an individual's self-image or interactions with others. So for example, you're 17 years old and you decide to get a little crazy and drive 80 miles per hour in a 65 zone, and you get a speeding ticket, but you go home and you tell your parents and you pay it off and you never speed again. That's an example of primary deviance, just a one-off occurrence. It doesn't result in a major change to your identity or your life. On the other hand, there is secondary deviance. And this is when a person's self-conception, their idea of their own identity, changes after his or her behavior is labeled as deviant by others. The person takes on the identity of the deviant, the rebel, or the troublemaker. So secondary deviance, it can become so strong that it starts to bestow what sociologists call a master status on the individual, wherein even the individual themselves starts to categorize themselves as deviant, and that being their chief characteristic of their identity. So an example would be, imagine maybe a 7-year-old kid in 2nd grade, and he acts up a lot in class. Maybe he talks out of turn or gets up out of his seat when everyone should be sitting, or doesn't stand in line correctly. Kind of all these minor infractions that you can commit when you're in 2nd grade. And maybe they don't have the most patient of teachers, and the teacher puts the kid in detention a lot, or sends them to the principal's office, or gives them lunch detention, and calls them out a lot in class in front of their peers and their classmates for disobeying or being deviant. So the results of that kind of action is that the teacher is consistently labeling the child as a deviant for a number of reasons, and the result possibly could be that the child over time internalizes kind of this label that's being ascribed to him, and at a certain point might kind of accept that label as his identity. Like, I am a bad kid. And you see a lot of stories about children like this who they're like, they thought I was a bad kid. I was always told I was a bad kid or a deviant. And what's the use of trying to prove them otherwise, or something along those lines. So that kind of story is an example of labeling theory. So our identities are what other people perceive us and label us as. Now, the second subtheory under symbolic interactionism comes from Edwin Sutherland, a sociologist, and he came up with his theory of differential association, which basically means the people who we hang out with or are exposed to most of our lives, especially our younger lives, kind of set the path for us, can lay out a deviant lifestyle so that we become accustomed to it and socialized into it. So differential association is about when individuals learn deviant behavior from the people close to them who provide models of and opportunities for deviance. So deviance here, it's not a personal choice, but it's learned through association. The more we are exposed to those who are deviant, the more likely we are to become deviant. So this theory can explain why crime is multi-generational. Studies have found that antisocial and criminal behavior in children is largely determined by whether their parents have ever been convicted or involved in criminal activity. So here, again, symbolic interactionism is about our closest intimate relationships and how those affect us. And so Sutherland is saying that we are not born deviant, we learn it by way of the people who are closest to us throughout our early lives, especially like our parents or our neighbors, our brothers and sisters, and our close peers. And the third sub-theory under symbolic interactionism comes from sociologist Travis Hershey, who came up with his idea of the control theory. So control theory views deviance as a result of an individual's feeling of disconnection from society. So individuals who feel they are part of a society are unlikely to lead a deviant life. And Travis Hershey laid out 4 types of social bonds that are incredibly important in order to connect people to society and, as a result, deter deviance. So he said people need to feel, number 1, attached to other people. They need to see that their actions have consequences, and if they're attached to other people who will judge their actions, they're less likely to commit deviant acts. Number 2, deviance can be deterred if somebody has a commitment to an appropriate lifestyle. In other words, the investments that we make in the community. So is the person a member of a church or a neighborhood association or a volunteer group? These people will be less likely to lead deviant lifestyles or commit crimes. Number 3, involvement in social activities. So whether or not an individual is a participant in social groups like sports teams or hobby groups, like bird watching or fishing or hunting or cooking classes. And number 4, belief in the values of a society. If a person views society's values as their own personal beliefs, then deviance is unlikely. So this one, control theory, is about all of our relationships in various arenas of social life, our friends and our family, our lifestyles, whether we go to church or part of the the homeowners association, or if we take part in a lot of like hobbies and social activities, or belief or have strong beliefs in the values of society, we are less likely to commit crime. So it's all about those interpersonal relationships, and the stronger our interpersonal relationships, the less likely we are to lead deviant lifestyles. So that was a bit of a dense overview of deviance, definitions, and all the different theoretical perspectives that we can take when we look at what deviance is and what it's not. And in the next kind of half of this lecture, we'll go and delve a bit more into crime, the law, and social control. So we'll go back to a couple just basic definitions here. So crime is defined as a behavior that violates official law and is punishable by formal sanctions. And legal codes maintained formal social control through laws, which are rules adopted and enforced by a political authority. So we're going a bit beyond kind of this conception of deviance as just anything like picking your nose, to kind of looking at deviance from the more political and enforcement perspective, which is going to deal more with kind of those formal norms and formal sanctions, which means that these things are written down and there are kind of these clearly stated punishments for particular instances of formal deviance. So we're going to look at a little overview of different types of crimes here. We'll start with the left and work our way to the right. So first we have violent crime, and this is any crime that's based on a use of force or a threat of force against a person. For instance, a criminal mugs someone by attacking them with a crowbar and hurts them. That would be a violent crime. Then we have nonviolent crime, which is usually a destruction or theft of property. So like graffiti or breaking a car window to steal $20 on the passenger seat, but you're not hurting any person. You're just destroying property or stealing without inflicting harm on a person. Then we have street crime, which is committed by ordinary people in a public space, such as pickpocketing. Corporate crime, which is committed by white-collar workers in a business environment, such as embezzlement, insider trading, or identity theft. So like Bertie Madoff or Martha Stewart was also convicted and served time for corporate crime. Then we have victimless crime, which is when perpetrator is not directly harming another person. For instance, if you're in your house and you're drinking a beer, but you're under 21, and in the United States, that would be a victimless crime, and you're not getting in your car and driving. You're not putting anyone else's health or life at risk. You are breaking the law, though. Or smoking marijuana in many states. Of course, some states it's legal now, but in Georgia, where we are, it is a victimless crime still, as long as you're not hurting anyone or getting behind the wheel of a vehicle. And prostitution is another example of a victimless crime, though that can be debatable depending on how the prostitute ended up in her position, whether she chose it or otherwise. But for the sake of the textbook, we will label it a victimless crime. And the sixth type of crime is the hate crime, and these are attacks based on a person's race, religion, sexuality, or any kind of identification or category that they are labeled as by others. So the U.S. criminal justice system exists to enforce that social order in society. So the criminal justice system is that social control that we talked about earlier in the lecture, and it exists to enforce social order. So there's three primary aspects to the justice system. That's police, the courts, and corrections. So the police are a civil force in charge of enforcing laws and public order at a federal, state, or community level. And these can be county police, state police, the FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security agents. Then we have the court system, and this is the system that has authority to make decisions based on the law. And there's state courts and federal courts, and your state courts are made up of your trial courts, traffic and small claims courts, appellate, and state supreme courts. And then we move up to the federal level, where courts deal with trade disputes, military justice, government lawsuits, and the judges at this level are appointed by the president with congressional consent. And the third aspect of this criminal justice system is the corrections aspect, which is charged with supervising individuals who have already been arrested, convicted, and sentenced for a crime. So within corrections, we have jail and prison. So jail provides temporary confinement while a person awaits trial or parole. Jails are more small and local. And then prisons confine people who are serving long-term sentences, and they're generally run by the state or the federal government, or they are contracted out to private companies by the state or federal government, which we'll talk about soon. Now, when you think about crime rates, especially if you watch a lot of local news, you probably think that crime is at an all-time high or that it's rampant. You hear a lot in Columbus about how high crime is and to watch your back and so on. But there is quite a stark contrast between perception and reality when we talk about crime rates. So particularly for violent and gun-related crimes, crime rates have actually been declining since a peak in the early 1990s. Yet, the public generally believes that crime rates are at an all-time high. Surveys show that people believe that crime rates are worse than 20 years ago, even though crime statistics show the opposite trend. What explanation can there be for that disparity between perception and reality? And your textbook talks about kind of all this explosion of popular crime shows that's happened since the 1990s, especially like CSI and Criminal Minds, Law and Order. There's so many more that can be added to that list. All the crime podcasts that have gained a lot of popularity. So kind of harkening back to our socialization chapter where we talked about media and socialization, this little section on crime rates is kind of making the same argument that the media is portraying crime and crime rates in a certain way, and because we see it on TV, we believe it even though statistics show the opposite trend. So on this slide, I have a video on crime rates and the difference of perception and reality. And in this video, it particularly looks at local news coverage of crime in New York City. And This activist here, he criticizes the overrepresentation of crime committed by Black people in comparison with official crime statistics. For instance, 83% of local news stories about theft featured stories about a Black person committing the crime. However, when you look at New York City crime statistics, 55% of the thefts were committed by Black people. So the local news coverage of theft, the stories, 83% of those stories featured a Black criminal, whereas if you actually look at the statistics, 55% of thefts were committed by Black people. So a little bit of a discrepancy there in terms of media coverage. And so that might also lead the people watching local news to think more than is fair to blame a certain race or group of people for crime when it's actually not reflected in reality and statistics. So the activist here that's talking, he says there is a, quote, stark contrast between crime that is actually happening and what the media is actually showing. And he claims that media coverage of crime that accentuates the role of Black people in perpetrating crime affects public opinion and also thus has effects on our policymakers' decisions and decisions made within the criminal justice system. Then on this slide, I have another short, I think it's 8-minute video talking about kind of this difference between perception and reality when it comes to crime rates in the United States. And this comes from a journalist, John Stossel, and he's interviewing John Roman, who's the senior fellow at the Urban Institute. And John Roman says in this clip, quote, people just don't know that crime is down. And he talks about in the 1920s to the 1950s, there were very low rates of crime in the United States. And crime rates, they started to grow during the 1960s and 70s and really exploded in the 1980s. But there was a lot of social control implemented during the 1980s, and crime rates went way down ever since the 1990s and still are on that trend. So John Stossel, the interviewer, goes out onto the streets of New York City and asks for people on their opinion on crime rates, and almost all of them said that crime was rampant and at an all-time high. Most people say that their own neighborhood is safe, but that the cities are full of crime, which is actually not accurate, but a reflection of local news disproportionately covering crime stories from the city. So there's another video on this slide. There's several on these last few slides, but they're all almost all of them are about 3 minutes long, so I hope y'all will take the time and just watch through these. But one key point made in your textbook and in this video is on the left side here of this slide, and that is a statistic that says the U.S. makes up only about 4 to 5% of the total global population, but the U.S. contains 25% of the global prison population. So we make up really a minority of the global human population, but our prisons hold 1/4 of the global prison population. So we have more people in prison in our country than any other country in the world. So this video is called Mass Incarceration in the United States, and it introduces itself by saying that the U.S. justice system is composed of 3 different facets: punishment, corrections, and deterrence. But the video argues that the U.S. is investing far too much in the punishment aspect of social control and not paying enough attention to corrections and deterrence. So again, the U.S. has about 4 to 5% of the global population, but contains 25% of the global prison population. The U.S. has the highest incarceration rate per capita in the world. That's a greater proportion of prisoners than North Korea, Russia, Ukraine, and South Africa. The video also argues against the U.S. practice of solitary confinement and points out that international law considers solitary confinement to be torture, and yet U.S. prisons continue to implement it regularly. The video also points out kind of the struggles once you get out of prison. So it's hard for prisoners to return to, quote, normal life when they get out. It's very difficult to find a job that will hire a former criminal. Former convicts are ineligible for welfare, student loans, public housing, food stamps, and kind of this inability to get back to, quote, normal for ex-prisoners can lead to what we call recidivism, which is kind of returning back to your old ways or your criminal activities in order to survive and get by. And many former convicts, if they don't go back to kind of their criminal lives, either become homeless or sadly end their own lives and commit suicide. And this video also kind of points out the economic aspect to the U.S. Prison system. It says that there's some prisons that require $100,000 a year per prisoner, and the U.S. prison system as a whole is a $75 billion a year industry. There's a lot of rural communities whose entire most of their population depends on local prisons to find work or make money, and so having this huge prison system while putting a huge inordinate number of people into prison also is providing jobs for a lot of people who might not otherwise have a place to earn a living. So it also introduces this kind of double-edged sword that if you were to reduce the prison population, it would take away jobs from people. And so it also points out that the prison system, it's an employment issue, that so much of our population should not be dependent on prisons being filled up to the maximum just so that people can have jobs in this country. So to kind of build upon what that video on the previous slide introduces, a few facts here concerning inequality in the U.S. justice system. Our jails and prisons are mostly filled with America's poor and a disproportionate number of minority men. In 2014, 57% of incarcerated men and 72% of incarcerated women had incomes below $22,500. So a very large majority of women in prison and a majority of men in prison were economically disadvantaged before they were locked away. Many of those prisoners are white, but a stunningly disproportionate share of them are black or minority. Black people in particular make up nearly 40% of America's incarcerated population, but black people only make up 14% of the total U.S. population. and are more than 5 times as likely as whites to be behind bars. The probability that a low-income black man has been jailed is around 52%. For an upper-income black man, it's 14%. So there's this kind of intersection here between class and race. Most people who are in prison are probably of a lower class status, weren't making a lot of money, and so turned to more deviant lifestyles, kind of hearkening back to Robert Merton's strain theory. And at the same time, a large majority of men and women in prison are minority or black or brown American citizens. But you see with this last statistic, if you're a low-income black man, your risk of being jailed during your life is 52%, but if you're an upper-income black man, it's 14%. So there's this intersection of class and race. So if you're black and wealthy, you're less likely to be imprisoned, but if you're black and poor, you are very likely 1 in 2 chance of you being imprisoned during your life. So on this slide, I have a link to another short video, about 3 minutes, titled The Enduring Myth of Black Criminality. And it's narrated by the black author and journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he's speaking on issues with the U.S. criminal justice system. He says, quote, "There's a long history of dealing with problems in the African American community, such as drug addiction, mental illness, illiteracy, homelessness, and unemployment, through the criminal justice system, criminalizing social problems that we don't do in other communities." He goes on to say 60 to 70% of people in prison and jail are suffering from a mental health problem. Over 50% of people in prison and jail are dealing with chemical dependency or drug addiction issues. So he says, quote, "Viewed from another lens, these are public health problems, not problems with criminality or something that people need to go to prison for. It should be more of a social action that's taken to deter this crime from happening in the first place and kind of combat the mental illness and the dependency issues without putting people behind bars." And he goes on to say the history of the U.S. justice system was to uphold the notion that black people are inclined to criminal activity. He talks about the Fugitive Slave Clause and how that was written into the U.S. Constitution. Basically meaning that in our Constitution, it is illegal for black people to pursue freedom, and it's a crime for them to kind of own their own bodies. Of course, that was changed later on with the 13th Amendment, but we'll talk more about that in a couple slides. Ta-Nehisi Coates in this video also points out the statistic that 1 in 3 African American men will end up in prison during his lifetime. And Coates says he doesn't necessarily think the U.S. criminal justice system, quote, "is broken." He says that it's working as it's intended. So that kind of perspective is more of a conflict theory perspective. If he says there's nothing wrong with this system, this is exactly how it's intended to work, is to put kind of a disproportionate number of poor and colored people into prison, he's looking at kind of that bigger institutional system of oppression, which kind of harkens back to conflict theory perspective. So I have a couple more videos here for you on the last 2 slides. This one right here is the only kind of pretty lengthy one that I've linked to in this lecture. I think this one's about 20 minutes long. But this one's a video interview with Michelle Alexander, who wrote a book called The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. She's a law professor at Columbus State in Ohio, and she did this interview back in 2015, which was shortly after the what I guess we'll now call the first wave of Black Lives Matter protests after the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And she asks in the interview, she says, quote, "Are we going to transition from protest politics to long-term strategic movement building?" She introduces a statistic that 94% of all people arrested for jaywalking are African American. Clearly, African Americans do not jaywalk that much more than people of other racial categories. So why are 94% of all jaywalking arrests African American people? This disparity concerning a fairly inconsequential misdemeanor illustrates the way that Black Americans are singled out by law enforcement. She talks about Michael Brown, who was shot by policemen in 2015, and he was actually labeled a criminal and being pursued by the policemen because he was initially jaywalking in Ferguson, Missouri. One quote she says toward the end is, quote, "The kind of change that needs to happen in our police departments and our criminal justice system as a whole is of such a scale that it's not going to happen merely by the good intentions of some legislators tinkering around the edges. We need transformational change." So again, a lot of the perspective that is coming out of the Black Lives Matter movement and protests is very much a conflict theory perspective. There's an idea that there are two different classes of people, and they are at opposing interests, and one class of people is oppressing the other for their own interests, and to kind of keep another group of people from achieving equality or success. Now, if the material we're covering this week is interesting to you and you have access to Netflix, I highly recommend, if you haven't already, to go watch the documentary titled 13th on there. But if you don't, the trailer is linked to here, and you can get a general idea of kind of the argument the film makes. So the 13th Amendment, it made it unconstitutional for someone to be held as a slave in the United States. And the video, this documentary, argues the exception to this 13th Amendment was criminals. And this documentary argues that after the 13th Amendment passed, a transition occurred in the U.S. criminal justice system, which systematically criminalized Black Americans. States required to keep our prisons filled, and the documentary also talks about kind of the monetization of prison system and the privatization of it, where a lot of private companies are now running our prisons. And of course, when a private company is running any enterprise, including a prison, they want to make sure they're making as much profit as possible. And the only way to do that when you are running a prison is to have maximum capacity in your prison, which leads to kind of this drive to arrest more and more people. So this documentary definitely criticizes that trend, and starkly makes a pretty poignant point at the end saying that today there are actually more Black Americans in prison than there were slaves in the 1850s. So this documentary goes over kind of a pretty broad history of African American reality in our country and kind of the struggles that we still need to grapple with, and inequalities left as residuals of kind of this time of slavery and oppression in our society, and that we still have a long way to go to achieve kind of indiscriminate equality with each other in this country. And that finishes up this week's lecture on deviance, crime, and social control. Covered a lot in this chapter. So thank you for bearing with me through all the theories and sub-theories. But hopefully that's given you a good, broad perspective on how sociologists deal with, define, understand deviance, and you have a little bit of an idea of the different kind of perspectives, the functionalist, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionist understandings of deviance.